We heard this morning one of the absolute best lessons in the New Testament. Not the one I just read, actually, which is tough. Let's be clear about that. You can't look back once you put your hand in the plow. And this story about James and John saying, "Oh, smite them with fire," and Jesus hitting them on the back of the head, I think. You don't quite get that in the text, but I think it's there. That sort of, what are you guys doing? Not so much that, as this lesson in Galatians. I want to unpack that a little bit and talk a little bit about why this is such a wonderful lesson and why it's really useful and a really practical kind of lesson. The first thing to know probably is to think a little bit about Galatians in general. The reading was wonderful this morning, by the way. But as we hear these lessons in the New Testament all the time, they begin to all kind of sound the same. Don't be fornicators or idolaters or sorcerers, and don't be greedy, and don't do this and this. And then you should be loving and kind. They all kind of start to sound alike. But in their text, they're very different. They're very different, and they come from very different places. And when Paul wrote Galatians, he wrote Galatians so angry he could barely stand. Yes, true. So, hopefully it'll get funnier, we'll see. But when he wrote, the way Paul wrote all of his letters is that he would go from town to town and he would plant churches. Galatia, Thessalonica, Corinth. He would go and he would get a church going over a year or a couple of years, and then he'd move on and start another one. But he'd always sort of get gossip and letters about what was going on in all these places that he planted. And so, some of them you hear really great stuff. If you read 1 Thessalonians, you read the letter of someone who loved these people. Sometimes I think Paul always wishes he had stayed in Thessalonica. He has a real love-hate relationship with Corinth, for example. And he writes the letter of Galatians so mad, so angry. What had happened was another group had come in and said, you know this gospel that Paul taught you, Paul, not a great apostle. Kind of a second-class apostle, in fact. And, really, if you were going to follow the gospel, you're going to have to be Jewish. You're going to have to be Jewish. It would be a little bit like if I came before you preaching today and said, I grew up in Texas. And I said, you people from Georgia are all right. I don't know what Ben teaches you here. He's a little second class. But if you were really going to be Christians, you'd have to wear cowboy boots and 10-gallon hats. That's what you've got to do. Sorry, I don't know what all this is, but it really, if you were going to do it. That's somewhat about what this was like, saying they needed to be Jewish, but it was all of that really ratcheted up. The debate is really about circumcision. And we say circumcision is a very clinical term, it's something that happens in a hospital. But that is not the case in this debate. Let's be really clear and think for a moment about what circumcision involves, all right? It involves adults cutting themselves somewhere very private. So all of these folks show up and say, if you're going to be Christian, you're going to need to go get a knife. And I'm going to tell you what else you're going to need to do. Paul is really worried about this. He's worried about this partly because he's getting undermined. But he's also really worried about it because this does not capture the vision of God's love that Paul had seen. It misses it. If someone has to be Georgian or Texan or American or Jewish or anything in order to be a Christian, it misses how big God's love really is. So the very first line is a little odd. For freedom, Christ has set us free. But you can get a feeling in that line about what Paul's thinking about. He doesn't say that Christ set us free so that we could all be Texans. Christ didn't set us free so that we could all be bricklayers. Christ didn't set us free so that we could all be bankers. Christ set us free for freedom. To really live out what all our many diverse and wonderful callings for freedom, and anything else less sells that short. So Paul is really worried about this. In fact, if you look in the lesson today, we read the first verse of chapter 5, and then we jumped to like 12 or 13. The verse right before 12 or 13 is where Paul says, I wish those guys telling you this would just go circumcise themselves. So, you get a feeling for how mad Paul is. All the letters kind of start the same way. There's a form for them. And Paul basically stands up at the beginning and says, This is Paul writing, the one who is an apostle, not ordained by those jerks in Jerusalem, but by God, and I'm writing to you. And he goes on to say, really, I mean, look, you read it and realize what it would be like to get this letter and be like, whoa. And they were read out loud in the church community, so everyone would have been standing around listening for their name and well wishes. And that was the first word out of his mouth. And the next word is, greetings and peace to you, or grace and peace to you from God and Father and our Lord Jesus Christ, who set us free from those jerks in Jerusalem. What are you doing? The whole thing, you should just stand, I mean, you could just shout all of Galatians you somehow. We've come, though, to the point in Galatians, kind of getting toward the end, where he's starting to unpack some pieces of what this means, a little bit of practice stuff. What this looks like. And that's where we get this passage today about mutual love for one another, about not consuming one another, which I find to be a really striking image. And also this whole business about these two lists of things where Paul tells them to discern the fruits to see where the Spirit is going. Now, if you've ever hung out in evangelical circles, this is sometimes called the fruits test. Which I think is a terrible name for it because I always think of thumping melons in the grocery store. But the idea that Paul has is that you're testing the fruits of things to see whether the Spirit is involved. Remember, God's love is so big that it involves all kinds of things. All kinds of things that may even contradict each other, that may not always get along, that may be wildly divergent. But God has redeemed all of it in this great freedom. So how then do you figure out where the Spirit is leading us? Well, says Paul, you see what grows out of it. You see what grows out of it. You try it and you see what happens. And if what grows out of it is idolatry, if it's anger and jealousy, and if it's hatred, all of which are self-destructive ultimately, they ultimately just destroy the person experiencing them, that's not the Spirit. And if instead there is peace, real peace, not sort of fake peace, like that kind of holding still and hoping nothing changes, but like full peace, like sitting at the beach and looking out at the waves and knowing there's not a better place to be. That kind of feeling, generosity, kindness, faithfulness. If these are the kind of things, the fruit that's getting born, then what is going on is the Spirit at work. This is Paul's advice in this great world of freedom. To watch the fruits of things and see what comes of them. Now, Paul says it's really obvious what all these bad things are. I actually think Paul is probably just not right about that. I think sometimes it's pretty hard to tell, particularly when you're in the midst of something, what its fruits are. So let me give you some examples of thinking about discerning fruits. So we'll start with something small. So when my wife fails to put glasses in the dishwasher, and instead leaves them all over the house on every available surface, and then says, have you seen my water bottle? It makes me angry. Kind of irrationally so, really. But by paying attention to that, by noticing that I just get really frustrated with her, rather than just being mean to her, doing something equally destructive, it pays out to notice that the only thing that fruit, that anger is bearing is just terrible. It's not doing anything for me. It's much better to just let it go. To just let it go. And truthfully, it makes for a much happier marriage. But there are a lot more complicated kinds of issues too. A little more complicated. I had my nephews in town over the weekend. They are 15 months and just almost 3 years, I think. And if you've ever been in a car with two young boys that age, it's just loud. I mean, there's trains banging on the window, and when you're 15 months old, you talk as loud as you can and scream just because you can hear your voice, and it's so cool. It can be pretty miserable when you're driving 30 minutes to Mexican food, much less at the Mexican restaurant when you can't take it anymore. And it reminded me a lot of a story I read of a woman from California who once, when she was on retreat, thought she had the best time. She was like, oh, this is peace. I've got it. This is it. And the next day, she was driving with her 3 kids in her car, stuck in traffic, and screaming, making all this kind of noise. And she thought, this is my life. This is it. I'm just stuck in this car in traffic forever with these kids. And then she thought, actually, you know what? This is my life. I am. this is where it's going to be. So what am I going to do about it? Am I going to let these continuing fruits of resenting my children and all this come forward? Or am I going to say, no, it's my life. I'm going to instead try and grow some generosity. Try and let them be who they are. And it gets even more. It happens when we make choices about our jobs. I don't know if you've ever read anything by Parker Palmer, but he's probably the best writer on discernment. He's a Quaker. And there's a great story of him trying to figure out what his next job should be. He was an English professor, and then he was a member of a religious community, and he got offered a job as president of a university. And he thought, oh, cool, that's great. But one of the things Quakers do sometimes is they sit down together and they ask one another questions about big calls that they're discerning in their life, trying to discern where the Spirit is, what the fruits will be. And so someone asked him, are you looking forward to the administration? And he said, no, I'm not related to the administrative stuff. And I said, well, you're interested in the visioning kind of stuff? No, the visioning stuff is not so much my thing. And someone said, well, the fundraising. Are you looking forward to flying around and fundraising? He's like, no, that's a lot of travel. I'm not sure I'm really excited about the travel part of it. And he slowly came to realize that what he was really excited about was the power and the amount of money he was going to make in this job, to be president of a university. And he said he really realized that when a friend of him in the group turned and said, Parker, there are easier ways to get your name in the newspaper. And he said, oh, that was the moment he realized that the fruits that were coming from that job were not for him. Were not for him. They probably were for someone else, but they weren't for him. Testing those fruits to see what grows out of them. I think one of the reasons that Martin Luther King stays with us as such a thinker and preacher and leader is because he was so worried about the fruits that would grow from his organization. He was so worried, and this is what nonviolence is about. It's about planting something that's only going to grow the right kind of fruit. Because if you just replace violence with violence, it turns out you might not have won anything. It's not always easy in our own lives. We rely on each other. The mutual love that Paul talks about. To recognize what fruits are growing in us. Looking for advice. Seeing what it's really about. Trying to see, is this happiness, or am I just afraid to try something new? Or am I just really trying to try something new to get out of being happy? It goes both ways. This is why I think this is one of the most useful and wonderful passages in the whole New Testament. And so I invite you to consider on this morning, what kinds of fruit have been coming up for you in the activities of your life, in your prayer, in your work, in your life at home, in your vacation in the summer? Have they been generosity and kindness? What kinds of things might be better just pruned and let go? Or what kinds of things might be better celebrated and fostered and fertilized and grown more? Things that you never knew would bring you that kind of joy, that kind of love that suddenly are there. Because this, Paul says, is how we respond as Christians to this great love, this terrific freedom that God has brought us. Amen. Amen.